Welcome to Boring History. Please give a like and subscribe to the channel. We are beginning our calm and gentle journey into the history of London's drunken plague era. This story will move slowly with soft descriptions and quiet details, so that you may listen, relax, and perhaps even fall asleep as the centuries drift by. The London of the 17th century was a city both magnificent and fragile. By day, its streets were alive with tradesmen, carriages, and the endless murmur of thousands of voices. By night, its taverns glowed with warm firelight, while shadows stretched across crooked lanes. And through it all, a quiet unease lingered, for disease was never far away. The plague, a dark and unwelcome guest, had long been part of Europe's history. But in London, in those years, it would return with a ferocity that shaped the life of the city forever. Imagine the narrow streets, paved with uneven stones, wet with rain and waste. Houses leaned toward one another, their wooden beams darkened by smoke. The air carried the mixed scents of coal fires, tallow candles, stale beer, and humanity pressed close together. It was a city that never truly slept, but it was also a city that never truly felt safe. Behind closed doors, families whispered of illness. At the edge of the Thames, ships brought goods, and sometimes death. Yet Londoners lived, as people always do, between fear and routine, and one of their strongest comforts was the tavern. Within those alehouses, men and women found more than drink. They found company, distraction, and the sense that perhaps life was still worth living, even when the plague crept through the alleys outside. The plague was not always visible at first. It began quietly, with whispers in one parish, then another. A neighbor who vanished behind shuttered windows, a cart rolling by with a shrouded figure. The bells of St. Paul's, tolling slowly, marking not the hours but the losses. And as fear spread, so too did the need for escape. Ale and wine became for many a kind of medicine, not for the body but for the mind. In the dim glow of tavern lanterns, the world outside seemed distant. There, laughter rose above the crackling of the hearth. Voices slurred with drink, retelling old tales, inventing new ones, while the mugs clattered together in fragile defiance of death. The tavern was a sanctuary, where fear was dulled by the bitterness of ale and the warmth of companionship. Some drank to forget. Others drank to believe, if only for an evening, that they would survive. But beyond the tavern doors, London remained uneasy. The watchmen patrolled the streets, their lanterns swaying. The city authorities struggled to contain the spread. Doctors, in their strange beaked masks, moved like dark birds through the alleys, carrying herbs to mask the stench and to keep away infection. Children peered through cracked shutters at the strange figures, while mothers pulled them back into the shadows. And still, life went on. Merchants sold their wares, fishermen hauled their catches, carpenters worked, bakers baked, and brewers brewed. For to stop was to surrender, and surrender was unthinkable. Instead, the people lived with the plague as they lived with the cold of winter or the rain of autumn, as something to be endured. And in enduring, they drank. The year 1665 was the great breaking point. The plague struck with a swiftness that London had not seen in generations. Parishes fell silent, houses were boarded, and the weekly bills of mortality listed hundreds, then thousands. The city was afraid, yet strangely alive in its fear. For those who could afford it, escape was possible. Out into the countryside, into estates away from the crowded streets. But for the majority, the poor and the laboring, there was no escape. Their refuge once more was the tavern. Inside those crowded rooms where the air was thick with smoke, men and women drank not only for pleasure, but because they believed it might shield them from death. Ale was thought to warm the body, to strengthen the spirit. Wine was believed to drive away the corrupt airs that carried infection. Even the strong spirits that burned the throat were welcomed, for they seemed powerful enough to burn away sickness itself. The truth was otherwise, of course, but truth mattered little in the face of fear. and so the taverns filled. Songs rose, sometimes mournful, sometimes wild. Old ballads about kings and heroes, new songs about neighbors lost, and drunken refrains that swayed like the flickering of candlelight. Some nights ended in laughter, others in tears. But all nights ended with empty mugs and weary bodies, returning to homes where death might already be waiting. Picture, if you will, a small alehouse near the edge of the river. The landlord, tired but determined, pours mug after mug, his hands red from the heat of the fire. Sailors sit at one table, their voices rough with salt and song. At another, apprentices whisper nervously about the rising tolls of the dead. A woman sells pies from a tray, her eyes hollow, yet her smile persistent. Every corner is filled, every bench crowded, and outside the dark streets are empty, save for the occasional cart that carries away the fallen. In such moments, drink was not simply drink, it was memory, ritual, and fragile hope. To drink was to join others, to share the burden of fear. The tavern became the beating heart of survival, a place where London reminded itself that it still lived, even as the plague whispered otherwise. This was London at the dawn of its most dreadful plague year, a city of fear and survival, of empty streets and crowded taverns, of silence outside and noise within. It was a place where death walked freely, but where life answered, stubbornly, with drink and companionship. And so the first chapter of our story comes to a close. We leave the taverns for now, the firelight fading, the mugs empty, the voices soft. Beyond the walls, the city trembles in silence. But within, the fragile song of life continues still. The year 1665 would forever be remembered as the year London trembled. The plague, which had whispered at the city's edges, now roared into its heart. It began in the parish of St. Giles in the Fields, where the first deaths were recorded, but soon it spread like fire through dry timber. Week by week, the bills of mortality listed rising numbers, at first a dozen, then 100, then 1,000. By summer, the toll was unimaginable. The rich fled quickly. Carriages rolled out of the city gates, carrying nobles, merchants, and even physicians who had sworn to protect life. The court of King Charles II retreated to Oxford, leaving London leaderless in its greatest hour of need. For the poor, however, there was no escape. The crowded parishes, with their narrow lanes and decaying houses, became traps. Families barricaded themselves inside, praying that death would pass them by. Signs were painted on doors, red crosses marking homes where sickness dwelt. Watchmen were stationed outside to prevent escape. Inside, the air grew stale and hope withered. But while the streets fell silent, the taverns still glowed. To step into a tavern was to step into another world. The cries of the dying were muffled by walls. The stench of the streets was drowned in the heavy scent of ale and smoke. Men lifted their mugs as if the drink itself could ward off the plague. And in their songs, one heard not only drunkenness, but desperate defiance. Physicians wrote pamphlets, warning against gatherings. Preachers thundered in empty churches, calling the plague a punishment from God. But still, the alehouses were full. Perhaps for many, if death was certain, better to meet it in company than in silence. Better to drown the terror in drink. To share the last moments of life with others, than to sit alone and hear the toll of the bell grow nearer. In July and August, the plague reached its height. The death carts rattled through the streets, piled high. "Bring out your dead," the drivers called. Lanterns swayed, shadows danced, and silence followed in their wake. But even then, the taverns remained. Within those smoky rooms, stories were told, songs were sung, and mugs were lifted as if to toast against the darkness outside. If London had a heart during the plague, it beat within its taverns. These were more than drinking places, they were gathering spots, meeting halls, stages of laughter and sorrow. Each tavern had its own character. Some were small, tucked into alleys, little more than a fire and a keg. Others were sprawling inns, with rooms upstairs, stables behind, and cellars deep below. The tavern keeper was part host, part healer, part priest. He poured ale as though it were medicine, and sometimes it truly seemed so. For in the alehouse, fear was shared and lessened. The poorest laborer could sit beside a sailor, a tradesman, or a clerk. Here distinctions blurred, and all were equal before drink. The drinks themselves were many. Ale, brewed thick and strong, was the staple. Wine imported from France or Spain was rarer but prized. And there were spirits. Gin was still in its infancy, but brandy, rum, and stronger concoctions found their way into mugs. Each sip was thought to warm the blood, to strengthen the body against corruption. Songs rose in those crowded rooms. Old ballads about battles and kings, psalms twisted into drinking verses, and new songs, created in the moment, half sung, half laughed. The sound was messy, but full of life. It was a reminder that even in plague time, London lived. By candlelight, faces glowed, sweat gleamed, and eyes shone with the brightness of drink. Arguments flared and faded. Friendships were made in the raising of mugs. And outside, the plague crept on, but here, for a few hours, it seemed far away. In plague time, fear bred superstition. Some swore that strong drink was the only cure. Keep the body warm, they said, and the pestilence cannot take hold. And so mugs were emptied with conviction, each sip believed to be a shield against invisible death. Strange remedies abounded. Some chewed tobacco, believing the smoke drove away infection. Others carried herbs, vinegar-soaked cloths, or even dried toads. But many placed their trust in drink. Ale was cheaper than medicine and far more pleasant. Wine was costly, but thought to be purer. Brandy burned the throat, but in that burning, people felt safe. Preachers warned against drunkenness, but even they admitted to drinking. Pamphlets suggested a good draught of strong liquor before visiting the sick. Doctors prescribed spiced wines, fortified ales, and cordials of exotic origin. The line between medicine and merriment blurred. There were darker beliefs too. Some said the drunkards died first, for their sins were many. Others claimed the plague avoided the drunk, for their bodies were too fiery for death to settle. In the taverns, such arguments were debated late into the night, between coughing, laughter, and the clink of mugs. By early 1666, the plague had begun to fade. The cold of winter slowed its spread, and the city breathed again. Doors opened, streets filled once more. The taverns, which had never truly emptied, became places of reunion. Survivors met and marveled at their fortune. Stories were told of neighbors lost, of families vanished, of narrow escapes. But London did not emerge unchanged. The memory of the plague lingered in every street. The habit of drinking, once comfort, had become custom. Taverns thrived as never before, for they had been the city's refuge, its sanctuary, its fragile heartbeat. The following year, another disaster struck, the Great Fire of London. Flames consumed much of the city, including many taverns that had stood during the plague. Yet even then London rebuilt. And as it rebuilt, taverns rose again, stronger, brighter, and more numerous. The drunken plague era had passed, but its memory remained in song, in story, and in the habits of a city that had survived. To this day, when Londoners lift a glass, they echo those who once drank not only for joy, but for survival. And so our story drifts to its end. The mugs are empty, the candles burned low, the city quiet. Thank you for listening. Sleep well, and good night.